Perfect. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending this month's Teach Educational Rounds webinar, Complex Client Case Addressing Tobacco Use with Youth. Here with me today is Joanna Seel from CAMH. So before we begin, I'm just going to go through some housekeeping slides. So remember, if you are interested in obtaining a letter of completion for today's educational round, please make sure that you have registered for the webinar and completed the pre-learning assessment. Please make sure that you are signed in to view the live webinar using your first and last name, not guest. That way I can track your completion. And finally, after the webinar, I will be sending out a link to an evaluation and post-learning assessment, and you'll have 1 week to complete that. Also remember that these webinars are being live tweeted on Twitter. So if you have a Twitter account, please follow the CAMH Nicotine Dependence Service at PS Quit Smoking. And if you want to tweet your own questions or comments, you can use the hashtag TeachWebinar. Here's our faculty bio. So Joanna Seel currently works in the Child, Youth, and Emerging Adult program at CAMH, and she works with youth that are experiencing mental health and substance use challenges. Here are her disclosures, as well as our disclosures. The Teach curriculum and slides were developed and compiled using funding from the Government of Ontario Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, and content of slides are primarily based on evidence-based guidelines from the following sources. Now remember that these materials, as well as the verbal presentation and any discussions, set out only general principles and approaches to assessment and do not replace the need for individualized clinical assessment or treatment plans. So we're just going to do some polling questions first just to gauge who's joined us today. So in a minute, I'm just going to have a question come up, and if you could answer it. So using your computer, please indicate what your current discipline is. And you may need to scroll down just to see all of the results. And it looks like the majority of you today are registered nurses. Cool. And another question. And again, using your computer, please indicate what region your organization serves. And if yours isn't in there, you work outside of Ontario or outside of Canada, you can feel free to type it in the chat box. But it looks like a lot of you are from the GTA. We do have a lot of people outside of province. That's wonderful. I see someone from New York City. That's really great. Okay, and one more question. So again, using your computer, please indicate which of the following you work for. And if it's not on here, you can definitely use the chat box. Okay, so a lot of people from family health teams, hospitals, public health units. Great. Okay, so without further ado, I will hand it over to Joanna Seel, and she will explain sort of the logistics of the webinar today, and we can get into it. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I'm excited to be here. Actually, this is my first webinar, I was saying, so pretty excited to do this today. So to start, I thought we'd kind of walk through a case that I've been working on. So as Lisa talked about, I'm a social worker that works in the Youth and Concurrent Disorders program over at CAMH. So a lot of what I'll be talking about today is kind of information gathered from working with young people ages 14 to 24. So that's the age range for most of the clients that we see. And so I thought today we kind of start with a case that kind of highlights kind of a pretty typical case of what we see in the youth addiction concurrent disorders, and I imagine probably has a lot of similarities with cases that other people here present also see. And talk through it a little bit, and then hopefully have a chance for people to ask some questions if they do, have some thoughts on the case. And then at the end, we'll kind of talk a little bit about some of what's known and not known around cannabis and tobacco use, especially mixing those two together, and talk a little bit about what are some ways of kind of addressing both of those things concurrently. So without further ado, we'll get into the case a little bit more. So to start, just to give a little bit of background, I work in an outpatient clinic, so young people often kind of are referred from lots of different referral sources, sometimes from doctors, sometimes from legal, and a lot of self-referral. So self-referral or schools or family members suggesting that young people kind of come in or have an appointment. So the person or the case I'm talking about today, and obviously everything name-wise and information has been kind of changed to protect confidentiality and identity, but is a young woman who we call Nicole, who attended an appointment at the suggestion of her mother, who was recently asked to leave school for a 1-week suspension as she was caught using marijuana on school grounds. Parents were pretty upset about the suspension, and so they'd asked her to go to CAMH for an appointment. And she came to the appointment mostly because her mom was really, really concerned about her, a little bit because she was concerned about the suspension with school, which is a pretty common scenario with the Youth Addiction Concurrent Disorders program that I work in. So she came in for her first appointment. I wasn't sure at first. I kind of thought that she was mostly there kind of because of mom and really concerned about that. But when she got talking, started really talking about lots of things at school and lots of things that she wasn't feeling so great about. So was feeling numb, talked about lots of anxiety related to social situations, lots of thoughts about I'm stupid, I say the wrong things, people don't like me, and feeling really kind of concerned about that piece. The other piece that came up is that she was using cannabis and tobacco primarily, with other substances as well, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But one of the other things that she talked about is that she was really not liking that when she was coughing up a lot of black stuff. So those were kind of the things that she talked a lot about feeling really concerned about in the appointment. So social stuff, coughing up black stuff, and feeling kind of really numb about things. So as far as kind of the substance use, looking at that piece, she talked a lot about mixing cannabis and tobacco. So she estimated using around 3 grams of cannabis most of the time per day, and that she often would mix it in with tobacco and use it in a bong or a water pipe. So what often in Ontario is called poppers. There's other names for it in other places, but a lot of clients will refer to it as poppers. And so she usually about 1 cigarette would give her 5 or 7 poppers, and she estimated she was probably doing 10 to 15 poppers a day, was what her guess was. And then on top of that, she also talked about smoking 3 to 5 cigarettes per day, and that a lot of this started when she was 13 years old. When I saw her, she was 19 years old, but talked about kind of regular use of cannabis and cigarettes probably since 13. She used throughout the day, sometimes with friends, mostly on her own, various methods, so sometimes bongs, sometimes water pipes, sometimes mixing tobacco and marijuana and cigarette papers. There was also kind of alcohol use on weekends, 4 to 5 standard drinks at a time, monthly use of MDMA or cocaine or hallucinogens. But those ones she wasn't so concerned about. Those ones hadn't really gotten her in trouble at school, hadn't really gotten her in trouble at home, hadn't really seemed to be interfering in her life very much. So the other piece to know that kind of came out in this first appointment with client is that, so she's 19, her mom, she lives with her mother and her father, and they lived on the western end of Toronto, and that she also had an older brother that had died of cancer when she was quite young. So that was something she briefly mentioned in the beginning, but didn't spend too much of a time on it, but did kind of notice that there was some distance in the family after that, was kind of her understanding of what had happened, or her kind of memory of that. She also, she talked about her mom being Portuguese background, her father was Mexican background, so she talked about those pieces as well, and that she felt really different from her family. She felt really different from her family and really different from people at school and social situations. So that was a big factor for her. That kind of came out in that appointment, but also as we talked a little bit about kind of the work from then on, that was something she really identified as feeling really different than people. So the next piece that was important to note with Nicole is that she'd had a lot of struggle with school. So she'd always found it very boring. She really disliked it. She found it really hard to focus in class. And that a year ago she had been transferred to an alternative school because she'd missed a lot of class. Often she was using marijuana and cannabis and tobacco with friends on lunch breaks, and had missed quite a bit of school. So after that, she'd moved to an alternative school. But I was having quite a bit of challenge there. She wasn't really attending very many classes, wasn't really liking school. The other piece she talked quite a bit about is that she felt really uncomfortable with people, and that most of the people that she had been connected to were people that used quite a bit of marijuana and tobacco as well, and that there was that was kind of most of the things that they talked about, most of the things that they did, and was one of her biggest interests was marijuana and tobacco and mixing those together. And outside of that, she's like, I don't really have anything that it really interests me, that I like to talk about with people, that I feel comfortable talking about with people. So that was another, I think, factor with Nicole. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about kind of treatment plan. But that was something that she mentioned even on, I think, maybe her first or second appointment, that outside of marijuana, there wasn't really many hobbies that she had and many interests that she had. One thing, we'll talk a little bit about strengths, because I think that one kind of came later in kind of working with her. But the other piece for Nicole is that she'd had really long-standing anxiety. She couldn't remember a time where she'd felt like she'd fit in with anyone. She'd had a lot of experiences of being excluded from games at school when she was younger, feeling like the odd kid. A lot of times were online on Facebook and online forums where people had kind of made fun of her. She had very, very long hair, and it used to kind of cover her face a little bit more, so people would make fun of that. And that was a really, she remembered that quite a bit. Like, people would pull her hair, people would talk about her being like a monster behind her hair when she was younger. And that really stuck out to her, and it sounds like she became more and more nervous spending time with people, kind of more and more concerned about what people were thinking of her and what they might do to her. And so that really started to impact how comfortable she felt around people and how comfortable she felt at school. So that was a significant piece. It had actually been marijuana, like kind of connecting with people around marijuana and tobacco, that had kind of helped her, because she felt like she had something to focus on with people. They felt like they had an activity. There wasn't pressure to talk about things. She felt like she wasn't the weird kid, like everyone there felt the same, and she felt like really included in that environment. So that was a piece to this as well. She also had a few experiences that really stuck out to her in her first couple meetings with her, of having people call her kind of a crackhead, having people call her a stoner loser. So she had I remember her kind of getting quite tearful with some of these remarks because those had really stuck out to her. Like, even though she's like, I don't use crack, like, that's not a substance that I use, but everyone thinks that about me. And in some ways, she was like, it's nice to have, like, people respect me for something and be interested that I know a lot about marijuana. And on the other hand, like, people get this other idea of me that doesn't feel like it's very accurate as well. So she had both of those two pieces going on. So that's a little bit about the case, a little bit about what kind of presented when Nicole came to an appointment. As I said, I was a bit surprised with Nicole because at first she talked a lot about her mom wanting her to be there and her mom wanting to be there and school wanting her to be there. And I was like, oh, like, I wonder where her motivation is around kind of wanting to be here and what she's interested in. But as she, I think, got a little bit more comfortable, she did really identify some things that she was really concerned about. She was really concerned about the anxiety. The other piece that came out is that she had felt really numb for quite some time. Like, she felt like while the marijuana helped her with anxiety and the tobacco use helped her manage her anxiety, there was this other part where she just felt really numb. Like, she didn't really care about anything. She didn't really have anything. She didn't have a lot of emotions about things. She didn't have any interest in things. And that a lot of her life revolved around marijuana and tobacco and those two things, and feeling like she wasn't feeling bad, and she also wasn't feeling very good either. So that piece was something that she identified in the first meeting. The other thing that she's really bothered about, which I kind of talked a little bit about in the beginning, is that it had taken up a lot of her life. Like, so as she talked about it, she was using in the morning, she was using in the afternoon, she was using before school, after school, midway through school, at home. She was skipping school to use. She felt like this had taken up quite a bit of her time and her energy. So that was another piece that she was quite concerned about. And she also, which is common I find with young people that are using both cannabis and tobacco mixed together, she was really worried about coughing up stuff. Like, she was noticing she was coughing up black stuff all the time. She found it hard to breathe. She was coughing kind of with walking upstairs, which she didn't really like. And she was pretty worried. She was getting pretty worried because the coughing was throughout the day and really bothered her, which is one of, I think, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but one of the things that often young people that are using both cannabis and tobacco together really talk about disliking is the coughing up black stuff as a result of kind of unfiltered cigarettes when they use it in the water pipe, that all of a sudden there's a lot of coughing, especially if they're using poppers every day, and that starts to really kind of make it hard for young people to kind of be active or do some of the activities that they want to do. And the other piece that everyone I find mentions is the coughing up black stuff is really gross. They don't like it. They get worried about kind of their health impacts as well. So before I talk a little bit about kind of what treatment looked like with this young person and how we navigated some of the challenges, is there anything that sticks out to people, or anything that people notice that they would really want to focus on with this young person, or any directions that they would take with Nicole? Just seeing some people are typing, so I'll give people a little. Oh yeah, someone asked a little about weight issues. Yes, body image wasn't necessarily something that she was super concerned about, but she had noticed that it was really hard for her to eat. So that with eating, and especially when she was using tobacco and cannabis together, that it was really making her eating patterns very sporadic. She would kind of have long periods of time of no eating, and then lots like at night, she'd have a lot of binge eating. So her eating patterns were really up and down and all over the place, which also affected her weight. So she'd actually had lost quite a bit of weight, but wasn't necessarily using in the hopes of either changing her weight or maintaining her weight in any way. Any other questions or things that stand out for people with Nicole before I kind of move on to what some of the particular challenges were with this case and the treatment plan? Yeah. So here I might mention the significant increase of tar deposits due to toking or using water pipe versus smoking a cigarette. Absolutely, yep. The tar deposits are kind of a big piece of the coughing up black stuff, and that's a really important information for young people to have. Yeah, someone else mentioned, where does she get the dollars? Her cannabis habit is expensive to maintain. So I think partially she was getting money from family, and she was also, I think, involved in getting large quantities of marijuana and then kind of giving them to friends for a larger amount of money. So dealing, but mainly with the cannabis. Interest in joining any clubs, organizations, sounds like her identity is wrapped up with marijuana. I'm glad you pointed that out, because that actually it was a really big piece with her, is that it was such a big part of her identity, it was such a big part of her social life, it was such a big part of her day-to-day life, that there wasn't much outside of it, and that so leaving it was going to be, or making any changes to it was going to be really, really challenging without kind of having something to kind of fill that large void that might be left if she were to make changes. So that was absolutely kind of a part of the treatment plan. So why don't I pop into a little bit about kind of talking about what happened with this young person. So as you can probably notice, the complicating factors with Nicole were the social anxiety was so high and had been so ongoing for such a long period of time, that the marijuana, tobacco was really connected to that anxiety. She mentioned a lot about, especially combining tobacco and marijuana, meant that it really helped with her nerves. Like the tobacco piece, really short-term, helped with her nerves, helped her feel a little bit less stressed, helped her feel a little bit less anxious, and then the marijuana over the long term, over the longer period of time, like the next 20 minutes to an hour, helped her feel a lot more mellow. So when she was spending time with people or when she was at school, those feelings of anxiety weren't really bothering her when she was using tobacco and cannabis. So that was like a really big piece, a really complicating factor for her if she was wanting to make changes to her substance use. The other complicating factor was she'd been quite young when she started using, so she didn't have, as someone kind of pointed out, she didn't have many other interests. She also didn't have much of a memory of what things were like before she started using tobacco and cannabis. And that meant that she didn't really have much to look back on, but she did, as I'll talk a little bit about next, have some things to look forward to. So there were some things that she'd feel like she'd missed out on or she was really interested in that she could think about wanting to do, but she didn't have much of a context for thinking about what were things like before that I was using, which I imagine a lot of people here have that with their clientele, that there's not necessarily, if the history is so long with substance use, there's not much to kind of think about what things were like before that, or things not being very pleasant before that as well. The other piece was the friend group. All use cannabis and tobacco regularly, and she was kind of an expert in the area of tobacco and cannabis use, and that felt really reinforcing and really nice for her. So that was complicated as well. And then the other piece that I didn't quite mention very much in my introduction was that family really wanted her to make some changes. They were really concerned about her. And what did happen is that the more family kind of talked to her about making changes, or she perceived pressure about making changes, the less interested she was in making changes. Although she actually had quite a bit of interest and quite a bit of motivation for making some of these changes and for things being different. So when she was starting to kind of take charge and that motivation was there and she wanted things different, if her parents started to talk about, hey, we're worried about you, or hey, we noticed things about, we want to make changes, how can we help you, those things seem to almost demotivate her sometimes. Like then she would be like, oh, like, I'm not going to do as good as my parents want me to do, or I'm not going to be able to make the changes they want me to make. So that was a complicating factor with this as well. So those were the bigger complicating factors with Nicole. As far as kind of what things look like as we worked together, so I probably saw Nicole 6 to 9 months in total, which is quite a chunk of time. But so there was a lot of different ways that things changed over that time. So initially, the first part was building motivation and confidence for making changes. She came in with some very, as I think most people do, some things she really didn't like, some things she really did want different. Those beginning pieces of motivation and change talk were there. I don't like this. I don't want this. I want things to be different. I don't like this black stuff. It really scares me. What if I get cancer? Her brother had died of cancer, so I think that was also on her mind quite a bit as well. So some of the initial part was kind of really talking to her about what was motivating her, what did she want different, what are the areas that would change if she were to make a change, how she would do that, what are the challenges that she would face, kind of talking through some of those pieces, and also hopefully eliciting some of these real solid reasons that she had for wanting to make a change. It sounded that for her the biggest pieces is she was worried about her health, the coughing up black stuff, wanting to be able to do more physical stuff, and she was really worried about feeling like her life had revolved around this. And she really wanted to have some interest outside of marijuana and tobacco. She really wanted something, whether it was school. She didn't really love school, so that didn't really feel like it, but she wanted to be doing something with people outside of marijuana and tobacco. So those three things became the real foundations for kind of what the work would be later, and the real things that actually, I think, inspired her and motivated her, especially when things were getting really hard. The other piece was addressing the social anxiety. So because it had been such a long-standing concern, she actually was connected to a psychiatrist, talked a little bit about medications that she might try, even just explaining what that was and giving her some background on what social anxiety is and how it happens, and some of these really normal reactions that she was having, or there's a term for it, there's an understanding of some of what this is, really helped her to kind of see, like, oh, one, I'm not the only one struggling with this. I'm not weird. I'm not a freak, because I think she used to use those two terms quite a bit. And two, give her some understanding what was happening. The other piece that happened with that is it gave an opportunity to start to talk about tobacco and cannabis and how it was helping sometimes, but also maybe making some of these things worse. And it gave her a chance to kind of experiment with that. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, but she kind of took control about trying to experiment with, hey, does this stuff really help my anxiety, or does it actually make it worse? And kind of get her own understanding of what was going on with those situations and what was helpful but also what wasn't helpful. In the end, she decided, I think, that she noticed that the cannabis was actually, while it helped in the moment, was actually making her anxiety around people much worse because she didn't feel like herself in those moments with people. She felt really out of it. So once she'd had a chance to kind of experiment with that, trying to reduce it for a little bit and seeing how that went, build it up and seeing how that went, she kind of came to her own conclusions about, oh man, this is actually making my anxiety quite a bit worse. The other piece was giving her some information, and we'll talk a little bit about this at the end as well, giving her a little bit of information about tobacco and cannabis and those things together, why she was getting some of the physical symptoms she was getting, how that might be helping and also how it might be challenging for her. Talking a little bit about the challenges of reducing substance use for those two substances. And so what are some unique challenges that might come with that? The physical dependence piece of tobacco plus the more of the psychological dependence piece of marijuana. Having those two together and intertwined when people are using means that stopping use of either of those substances can be a bit more challenging. So once her motivation and confidence was up a bit more, it gave us a chance to really talk about those things and think about what would make sense for her, what were her biggest challenges and biggest things she wanted different around her substance use, and what would be the best way of kind of approaching that together. So with that, she started to attend a group with other young people, and that was a short group and was kind of geared to, one, getting her connected with other people that were making changes to their substance use, and two, getting her connected to people in general and kind of testing out some of this, meeting new people in a really structured way and seeing how that went. And she really actually enjoyed that. And that actually is where I think some of her motivation started to build even more. So seeing other people making changes, feeling a little bit more confident than I think she thought she would in a group setting, helped her see that, hey, like I can do this, and I do like how I'm feeling with some of these changes as well. So that was another piece. And then at that point, she was ready to, for a couple things. One, to have a chat, bring her family in and have a talk with her family. And two, she's also ready for looking at what reducing tobacco and cannabis use would look like and making kind of more of a plan for that for her. And I know, again, like I got to work with her for quite some time, and not everyone has some of that luxury. So one of the things is having her family involvement. Her parents could see some of her hopes and her ideas and some of her plans for making changes, which helped them to feel a little bit better about, hey, she's taking this under control. Like she's doing some of this stuff, and we don't necessarily have to worry as much about her. There's different ways that we can support her versus kind of reminding her about her substance use. So that was helpful. It also, the brother's death ended up being something that was talked about as well. Like I think that was just happened to happen, but it sounded like there was a lot of fears about cancer and that happening for Nicole, and some of the fear that the family members felt and some of the fear the parents had about that as well. And then for her, the pieces that we were addressing was kind of really looking at what concerns she was having with her tobacco and cannabis use and how to make a plan that would feel realistic for her and that would address some of those challenges of making changes to tobacco and cannabis, especially when they're mixed together. So for her, she was really, really concerned about a lot of the tobacco impact. And it felt like for her, she's like, I think I'm going to be more successful if I'm able to take out the tobacco. So taking out the tobacco first from her mixture. So instead of mixing tobacco and marijuana, cutting out the tobacco from mixing of her marijuana and just having marijuana instead. And so for her, it was only using marijuana, and then tracking the marijuana to see how that went, because it's typical for that to increase a little bit when people make a change like that. And so for her, tracking that for the next 2 or 3 weeks and seeing what that was looking like, she felt was helpful. And then the other piece was actually introducing NRT for her as well, so nicotine replacement therapy, to see if that would help with some of the nicotine, the cravings, the withdrawal symptoms for that. And that for her, she did have a really positive experience with that. And it did help her to reduce her overall tobacco use. So then it was more, she was more just using cannabis. And then that was when she started experimenting with cannabis and deciding, hey, how much is this impacting me? How much is this not? And deciding for herself, like, hey, I actually think using it the way I'm using it right now is actually making social stuff much harder for me. So that's when she decided to make further changes to that. But that took, that was kind of a longer term process. I'd say overall that whole period of time was about one to 2 months, just kind of getting the tobacco piece. The other piece was getting connected, which someone actually mentioned already, was getting kind of connected in some other things. So getting, we did a lot of talking about values and interests and what drives her. So that was a big piece as well. So she actually, her family member were very musical, and so she'd always had an interest in that. So her family actually helped her get set up with like a music class with other people her age. And that piece was a big part for starting to build her identity and interest. And also, like, socially was a nice way to be in a structured environment where people are doing something. The social burden was a little bit less, so she could kind of get used to starting to hang out with people without necessarily using substances. So I'm just noticing a couple questions, and I think now it's kind of a good time to kind of open things up for questions a little bit. I have a couple other slides, but maybe I'll answer some of these questions and give people a chance to write questions if they have them. I think the biggest piece for her motivation is that she came to see you and willing to see psychiatrists involving her parents. Yes, absolutely, yeah. She was really nervous, I think, at first, but then I think it was one of these processes where she got a little bit more comfortable, and each time she got a little bit more comfortable, she was willing to kind of have a little bit more people involved, so psychiatrists involved, think about medication, having your parents involved. It was kind of like this baby steps, which I'm sure everyone here can probably appreciate in the work that they do. Did she find a new group of friends who are positive role models, getting involved in more healthy behavior, or did she search out like-minded friends? Has an extracurricular music group offered to her to redirect and give her a positive outlook? Yeah, so I think the music group did help. Like, she got really interested in music, so it became almost in the way that she'd had a lot of focused interest on marijuana. She had a lot of focused interest on, I think it was guitar. So she really kind of put a lot of practice and time into guitar, and then that allowed her to kind of have this social group all around guitar, and then that started to build. So again, it was baby steps, but her first time being like she did the group in the program that I work in, and then she tried another group in the program I worked in, and then she tried the music group, and then she started at a different school. I think all of those started to build so that she actually started to have friends outside of using substances ultimately. And in the process, it was interesting because she was having those same friends that she was connected to around substances, and she just started hanging out with them less. So it was a very gradual process. Like, she just was like, I don't want to we're not going to do much. So when I have another offer to do this, I'm going to go hang out with the people I play music with and do music versus doing this because it sounds more interesting to me. So she kind of was able to make that change very gradually. What dose of NRT she started with? Was she using 3 to 4 cigarettes a day? Yes, so she was using about 3 to 5 cigarettes a day, and she was probably using about 2 to 4 cigarettes in combination with the marijuana as well. I can't remember I think she ended up using using gum as the NRT, and I can't remember what her dose was with that. Would carbamazepine be a better alternative to using NRT, especially with youth? Those would be good questions. I think part of the reason we went with NRT is that it's easy for our service to do that, to get people connected with NRT, with the patch or gum, and for free. So I think that's kind of why we typically do that one as well, and we have kind of quite a bit of evidence around that one as well. So those tend to be why we pick that NRT. Is there any other questions about this one, or thoughts about maybe things that you would do differently as far as the treatment plan goes, or similarities you've seen with other cases? She did go on medication for anxiety. She went on fluoxetine, I believe, for anxiety. And she found it was a good benefit. I think at one point, I think she ended up tapering off of it after a period of like 8 months or something like that. After changing her cannabis use, I think she decided that she wanted to go off of that as well. So. Switching to edible cannabis. Yeah, there's much less risk, or some less risk as far as some of her health concerns around the coughing up black stuff, and that would have been changing kind of when the high hits her. So all of those would have been, if she'd been really interested in that, that could have been something that would have been explored. She wasn't. She was very much wanting to really reduce things overall, but that would have potentially been something to explore if she was worried about some of those health impacts, but wasn't wanting to kind of make changes to the total amount of cannabis that she was using. All right. Any other questions? Also, so the approach that we typically take in our service is very much kind of a harm reduction approach, and we kind of provide information about what we know about tobacco and cannabis and what we know about ways to make changes to those things, but then we kind of work with the youth to kind of figure out what's going to work on the things that they're most concerned about around substance use. What do they feel like is the most realistic and feasible? So all of those pieces come in. So that's where kind of something like edible with cannabis with one client might be something to really work towards if they're concerned about some of the lung impacts of the tobacco use and the cannabis use. So the next couple slides, I just had a few slides to kind of talk about things in general. So this was just kind of, people often ask, how do you know what all the, what the terms are, and what are kids calling this and that and the other thing? So poppers is a really popular term that's used right now with young people to talk about smoking cannabis and tobacco in a water pipe or a bong, usually named for the popping noise that it makes once you've sucked the nicotine through. So that's where the name comes from. A lot of people are like, oh, I thought that was a different drug, but a lot of when young people 14 to 24 are talking about poppers, it's often the cannabis tobacco mixed in a water pipe that's or a bong that they're talking about now. It's got lots of other names elsewhere, but poppers seems to be the most popular one in Ontario. And then there's also different ways of smoking cannabis and tobacco. So the smoking in a bong is a little bit more common right now, but it's been mixing cannabis and tobacco has been around for years, but often was rolled in cigarette papers or wrapped in tobacco leaf. So those are some of the pieces, or some of the terms that young people are talking about. So again, this reasons youth identify using cannabis and tobacco. As far as, excuse me, this is kind of coming from working with young people. These are kind of the ones that often come out in your discussion as, hey, what's working about this? Okay, all right, tell me a little bit about what you don't like or what's not working so well about this. These are often the ones that are at the top of the list for people. So as far as what's working for people, or what youth identify as really working for them, is often it's used initially to stretch out cannabis use. So they can have cannabis that lasts for longer, or they can have their marijuana supply last for longer if they mix it with tobacco. So that seems to be the reason that young people especially kind of keep going and often start using it. A more immediate high from nicotine and a longer lasting high from cannabis. So they often will talk about the head rush from nicotine and the longer lasting high from cannabis. And some young people really hate that combination, but some young people really love that combination. So that's often identified as something that people find really helpful or really enjoy about using them together. They find it more helpful as far as stress relief or anxiety relief because the nicotine hits so quickly that they get an immediate stress relief, and that over time the cannabis kind of helps them longer lasting stress relief. I mean, the downside of that is it's very much a short-term solution, often makes a lot of those symptoms and concerns worse, as it did in the case I talked about earlier. But that's often what youth talk about when they talk about things that they like or are helpful with it. And tobacco moderates some of the sedative effect of cannabis. So especially with focus, if they put tobacco with cannabis, young people have talked a lot about the focus is easier, they can focus for longer, those pieces. And then taste is smooth. I find not so many young people are talking about that, but that does come up sometimes. It's more of these first few ones. Any ones that people add with that, like in people's work with young people or with adults even? Any things that come out as being helpful for clients? So these are, again, based on kind of working in the Youth Addiction Concurrent Disorders program. These are the most common things that come up as challenges that youth identify around using both cannabis and tobacco, mixing it together. So coughing up black stuff, I would say, comes up like 99% of the time. Again, someone had mentioned like from the tar buildup and the unfiltered cigarette, that's where that coughing comes from, and it can be quite persistent, and it can be quite, people talk a lot about like, I don't like how gross it is, I don't like that the bong water is so gross. Like the gross part of it is often usually in the top 1 or 2 reasons that people don't like it. The lung capacity and impact on physical activities, that often comes up as well. They have much more intense cravings for combining cannabis and tobacco than just using either of them singularly. So people find, and as a result of that, often end up using more cannabis than what they might have been before they were mixing. Higher level of irritation and agitation, particularly when unable to use. So they just find that that's a lot more stressful, a lot harder for them. And some youth identify it increases their use of cannabis over time as well. Again, this is just a little bit. So there's not so many studies, and there's not been a lot of research, and that's not my forte either. I'm much more frontline clinical, but there hasn't been a whole lot of studies on mixing cannabis and tobacco. There's a few, but a lot of times people try and have singular samples of just tobacco or just cannabis users. So it's hard to kind of tell some of what some of that combination might be. But there are thoughts that it does increase dependence to cannabis, than if cannabis is used alone, that people will use more cannabis when it's mixed together. There is kind of thoughts that cannabis and tobacco appears to impact hippocampus and memory behaviors in a different way than just cannabis or just tobacco. So that's, again, there's more research coming with some of those pieces. And it does appear to exacerbate the physical and psychological dependence symptoms when you mix them together versus when you use them alone, which means that it can be harder to make changes to it, which means often kind of suggesting looking at both tobacco and cannabis when someone wants to make changes if they're mixing it together, because they both really do impact one another. So a few things to keep in mind when working with youth that are mixing cannabis and tobacco. I know someone had mentioned this already, and we've talked a little bit about this, but addressing both the tobacco and the cannabis. So providing information about both, providing kind of health impacts of both, providing some of the impacts of physical dependence and psychological dependence for both cannabis and tobacco, so people have both of that information, because it can, when you're using tobacco and cannabis together, both of them can really impact. Understanding motivation and confidence factors for both substances, so what's kind of motivating you to make changes? Are you more worried about that health, the lung factor, or are you more worried about the numbing piece, or are you more worried about like what might it be, and helping to kind of suss that out and build some of that motivation and confidence for both factors. Tracking both substances, so especially if they're using it together, kind of help tracking them, especially if they make any changes to one or the other, either tobacco or cannabis. It's pretty common for the other one to increase in use, so are there some ways of modifying that? Are there some ways of supporting them so that that at least they know that that's happening, and so that it gets addressed over time, or are there some ways of supporting with them with some of the withdrawals or the side effects of making changes to either cannabis or tobacco? Collaborating on a plan that addresses or considers both substances is a big one. Oftentimes, in young people that I work with, reducing the tobacco out of the cannabis tobacco mixture is often the first step, and there can be a little bit more support with some with helping to make the withdrawal a little bit easier for some of that. But I've also seen people that have reduced them concurrently as well, so reducing both tobacco and cannabis at the same time. So it depends on what's going to feel the most realistic, what they're motivated for, what's going to give them the most encouragement as well, like what are they going to see with results with to help kind of build their motivation with that. And then I have kind of discussing nicotine replacement therapy as well as one of the options. So is there any questions? I know we have 12:52, but are there any questions that people have? Some questions about legalization of cannabis, impact of perception of use. That is a hot topic right now. I have a lot of young people that are super excited about the legalization of cannabis, and it will be interesting to see kind of how that changes things, and what that does, especially for young people, what that does for access for young people. Yeah. Anecdotally, some youth are seeing legalization as an endorsement that cannabis is safe. Yes, yeah. I think I've seen some of that as well. Although by the time that people get into the service that I work in, a lot of them are noticing the impacts on their health and their well-being. So they're already at the point like, there's definitely some downsides for me with some of this stuff. Yes, copies of the slides. In many respects, as I'm sure we all know, substance use is usually a symptom of a more underlying issue. Yeah, like 90% of the young people that I see, it's substance use is a way of self-medicating. As in the case presentation, it was absolutely about anxiety. It was absolutely about feeling different. I think it was grief and loss from her brother, like all of those pieces that this filled a void with. Have you had any cases where they quit smoking cigarettes, maintain cannabis smoking as usual? Yes, yep. I'd say because the health impacts of tobacco can be a little bit more immediate, like the coughing up black stuff, the lung capacity piece can be a little bit more on people's radar and impact them more, and they're more motivated by that I have seen young people that will completely cut out cigarettes or really reduce it, or try a different method of using tobacco and keep their cannabis the same. Talk to Eloise about downsides. We'll just do one more question because I know we got to wrap up here. I'm glad. Thank you guys. I appreciate all the nice feedback. You need some of these youth to talk to other youth about the downside of using both substances, 100%. Actually, a couple of young people do some peer supporting in some of our groups because, like, it means so much more coming from young people than it does from social workers or nurses or people in the healthcare professionals. All right, I will hand it over. Thanks again, everyone. This is really fun, and yeah, this has been fun.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Joanna. That was super informative. You're a great presenter. I'm just going to say it. So before everyone signs off, I just want to do a few more housekeeping slides. So remember, if you do want your letter of completion, I will be emailing out a link to the evaluation and post-learning assessment by this afternoon, and you'll have 1 week to complete that. And if you participated as a group or you signed in via teleconference, please make sure to email teach@camh.ca, just letting me know, and you can do that before 2 p.m. As well, our next Teach Educational Rounds will be held on Wednesday, December 6th, and that's going to be presented by Dr. Lori Zawarteo of CAMH, and it's going to be focused on an update on e-cigarettes. And again, if you missed the beginning of today's presentation, you want to view it again or share it with some of your colleagues, you can view our archived webinars on the link to our website, which is listed below. And thank you so much. Have a great rest of your week and stay warm. Thank you.